While most shark attacks are due to mistaken identity, there are rare instances where sharks exhibit predatory behavior towards humans. In these exceptional cases, sharks actively hunt and attack people as prey. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we go over 3 times sharks have launched predatory attacks on humans. Welcome to Final Affliction.
Boyfriend and girlfriend Roy Stoddard and Tamara McAllister were two 24-year-olds who met whilst teaching in the same school in West Malibu, California. They initially bonded over their sense for adventure. Tamara was preparing for public health work in Kenya as part of her master's degree. Roy turned his hand to anything from mountain climbing, biking, and surfing to scuba diving and kayaking. The two of them spent all their spare time hiking, camping, and kayaking together. On Thursday, January 26, 1989, the couple were training for a triathlon that they were planning on competing in together. In preparation for the upcoming race, they kayaked and swam daily. Their usual route took them on a 3-mile round trip from Latigo Point to Paradise Cove. They each took a single-man kayak into the water on that fateful day. They headed down to the water just before 9 a.m. Pausing on the sand, they both sat down and enjoyed a hot cup of coffee and a muffin to kickstart their day. A passerby saw them launch at 9:30 before they paddled northwards around Latigo Point and on towards Paradise Cove. It was like any of their other training days. The couple were happy and excited to spend the time together. The wind was light and the seas were fairly calm. As they paddled into the sea that day, they were never to return again. There were no further sightings of the couple alive. Tamara's body was found 2 days later. This story is based on the findings and subsequent report by the case investigator Ralph Collier. The following is one of the number of possibilities that could have happened to the couple and is based on circumstantial evidence. After finishing their coffee, they put on their windbreakers and zipped them up over their swimsuits. These were blue and black wetsuit-style jackets that kept them warm on the open water. As the wind was picking up, there was a chill in the air. The couple paddled to about 100 yards out, remaining shoreside of the kelp beds. They knew it was safer not to paddle beyond the kelp forests, as more often than not, they act as a natural deterrent to sharks. After heading around Latigo Point, the wind buffeted them. It whipped the surface of the sea, the salt spray wetting their faces and stinging their eyes. They bowed their heads against it, digging in and persevering. The training route usually took them 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how long they stopped for a swim at the halfway point. Today, it was taking them a bit longer. They lashed their kayaks together as Tamara was being blown off course. The momentary pause in paddling gave them a breather and some respite. They decided to continue. Roy made headway in the lead kayak, cutting a wake for Tamara to follow. He felt the tugging of the rope every so often as it went taut, pulling Tamara back on course. It wasn't long before they could see their halfway destination, Paradise Cove. But they never made it. Suddenly, without warning, there was a tremendous smash from below the water. Something from the depths torpedoed upwards and struck the boats from underneath. The two of them were thrown from their kayaks and slammed into the sea. Tamara resurfaced, coughing and sputtering, unsure of what had just happened. Seconds later, she felt a tremendous tug on her left thigh and was pulled underwater. Kicking and thrashing around, she desperately tried to pull herself to the surface, but a shark had a strong grip of her leg. She could feel her lungs about to burst as the shark twisted and turned underwater. Roy had knocked his head on his kayak when he had been thrown into the ocean. Dazed and dizzy, he frantically blinked, trying to make sense of the situation. Seconds later, he heard the terrified screams of his girlfriend as she momentarily resurfaced. He wheeled around to see a sea of red and their upturned kayaks bobbing in the water. He immediately swam over to the commotion and managed to grab Tamara's hand. Pulling her above the surface of the water, she gasped for breath. He held on to her, trying desperately to pull her to the boats. The hulls of the kayaks were wet and slippery. Each time he tried to grab on, his hand would slip. He lifted one side, trying to flip it back over, but the weight was immense, and whilst holding onto Tamara with one arm, he didn't have the strength to right the boat. He tried again and again. The commotion in the water was witnessed by Margaret Bloom. As she looked out of her living room windows at 10:15 that morning, she noticed an incredible boiling of the water and thrashing about. It was out past the kelp beds near a large United States Coast Guard buoy. She spotted a number of seals leap out of the water onto the surface of the buoy, avoiding the churning sea. They were anxious and agitated. It is unclear whether this commotion was a shark attacking one of the seals or whether it was the actual attack on Tamara and Roy. If it was the former and had unsuccessfully caught a seal, the same shark may have turned its attention to the kayaks a few moments later. As Roy held on to Tamara, keeping her afloat, he could feel her slipping away. The shark had severed her femoral artery and she was bleeding out. But the shark hadn't finished yet. It returned, and in a frantic attack, it took hold of Roy and dragged him underwater, never to be seen again. When the couple didn't show up to work the next day, their friends and colleagues raised the alarm. People knew that Tamara and Roy had taken the kayaks out, and they knew their routine paddle. The kayaks were found the day after the attack. They were floating and upturned less than 20 miles from where the couple had paddled, on the opposite side of Santa Monica Bay. The kayaks had stress fractures along their hulls, and one had a hole in the bow. On examination of this evidence, an engineer suggested that significant impact and force would cause this kind of damage. The object that struck the kayaks needed to have been in excess of 2,000 pounds, or 900 kilograms, and traveling at least 17 knots. These are characteristics of a great white shark. These incredible apex predators are also known to attack their prey from behind or from underneath, often shooting out of the water as they do so. The following day, the crew of a sailing boat found Tamara's body floating in the water. The current had carried her 30 miles north of Paradise Cove, near Channel Islands Harbor. She was still wearing her jacket, which suggests that she wasn't swimming when she was attacked. Her injuries included deep bite wounds to her upper thighs. One had severed her femoral artery and vein, and the other measured more than 34 centimeters or 13 inches in diameter. She had bruising to her hand and head, possibly from being thrown from her kayak. From the size of the bite marks and severity of the injuries, it was concluded that a great white shark measuring at least 5 feet long had been the cause of the fatality. Following the discovery of Tamara's body, the United States Coast Guard conducted a search and rescue operation by both boat and helicopter to try and find Roy. After a week-long search, no trace of him was ever found. This devastating attack happened within sight of the shore, and yet no one witnessed it. The young couple were both fit and adventurous. Although Tamara was new to kayaking, Roy had been on the water since childhood, and both were exceptional swimmers. Their lives were cut tragically short, simply doing what they loved. While the ocean and its beaches provide us with some of nature's greatest playgrounds, we must remember that this is the shark's habitat, not ours. And despite how experienced and prepared you might be, one encounter with these murderous creatures can lead you to your unfortunate final affliction.
The shark attack on Faye Jones Bester was the final attack of a spate of shark attacks that plagued the KwaZulu-Natal region of South Africa. Dubbed Black December, the shark attacks began on the 18th of December the year before, in 1957. A teenager was bitten by a shark whilst surfing in the region. He survived the attack, but others weren't so lucky. Between December 1957 and April 1958, 9 people were attacked by sharks in the coastal waters near the port of Durban. 6 of these proved to be fatal. Faye was on vacation with her family. They had been through a lot recently. Only the year before, she had tragically lost her husband when he had been killed in a motorcycle accident. Now, raising her 4 young children alone, they were enjoying a family holiday for the first time since losing their father. The morning of April 5th was overcast and gray. The air was warm and humid. A damp mugginess filled the air. Faye and her children headed down to the beach. It was situated at Uvongo, 80 miles southwest of Durban. The water was relatively calm, but it was muddy and murky. The night before, a strong swell had battered the coastline, churning up the seas, turning them from blue to brown and gray. The beach was popular with surfers. At the break of dawn, they entered the water, bobbing up and down on the water's foaming surface, catching wave after wave and gliding into KwaZulu-Natal's rugged coastline. Faye walked across the sand. She slipped off her shoes and made her way to a spot near the water's edge. The sand was rough and coarse. It crunched under her feet. Her children followed eagerly. They dumped their things on the ground and immediately set about playing with each other on the beach. By mid-morning, the clouds were beginning to clear. As it did so, the bright sun beat down on the family. It was heating up. Whilst the children played on the beach, Faye decided to take a dip. The shark's board boat was hovering 30 to 40 meters out from the beach. They were leaning over the side of the boat, hauling up the shark net and inspecting it. The stormy seas the previous night had damaged the net. These nets had been installed in 1952 to protect swimmers and surfers from shark attacks. It was a system that had worked well. It had dramatically reduced the number of attacks along South Africa's beaches, and it had filled locals and holidaymakers with a sense of security each time they entered the water. Even to this day, every morning at dawn, the sharks' board go out to check the nets. Mile upon mile, they haul the nets, checking for any sharks and checking for damage. On this particular morning, they sent a clear warning to beachgoers not to enter the water after finding one of the nets was broken. It would take them some time to repair the net, and whilst they did so, the only safety barrier between humans and sharks would be removed. Upon hearing this news, Faye decided she would go for a paddle instead. She entered the water just by the mouth of a river. There was a group of about 18 people doing the same. Some were even swimming in the sea despite the cautions. Faye kicked the water slightly. Feeling the coolness on her feet as she looked out to sea, she could hear her children playing happily on the sand. Jeff Wolf, owner of the Uvango Hotel, which stood meters from the beach, spoke with the group. He warned them that it wasn't safe whilst the nets were being repaired. A couple of people heeded his warning and left the water, but most, including Faye, remained. Then suddenly there was a commotion in the water. In an instant, the peaceful scene turned to terror. A huge splash, and Faye was knocked off her feet. In knee-deep water, a 10-foot great white shark came barreling into Faye's legs. She fell forwards, landing in the water with a splash. Within seconds, the shark had grabbed Faye's torso and threw her up in the air. Faye screamed, then she smashed back down into the sea. The group she was with frantically slapped and kicked the surface of the water to deter the shark. Faye didn't have time to get up out of the water to get away. In only seconds, the shark wheeled around to Faye's body. As it did so, its rough skin and powerful tail and fins cut and abraded another woman's legs in the shallow water. The shark opened its jaws wide and clamped down around Faye's torso. It thrashed around, tossing Faye's small body from side to side as it ferociously bit into her. But with all the commotion going on around it and all the people shouting, the shark let go of Faye and swam off. Rescuers rushed to Faye's side. She lay in the shallow water, still and silent. The water around her was bright red. She was hurriedly carried out of the water and to the beach only meters away. Before she was even laid on the sandy ground, she was dead. It was a death that shocked those who witnessed it. It was a truly terrible and tragic end to the young mother's life. At just 28 years old, she left behind her children, aged just 8, 7, 6, and 3 years old. There were some 500 people on the beach that day. There were many people in the sea despite the warnings of the sharks boards and the locals. Some people were in much deeper water than Faye, and she and the group of people she was with assumed, standing in only knee-deep water, they would be safe. Eyewitnesses said that the attack had only lasted a few seconds. It had been intense and rapid. Faye had died from massive blood loss and shock as the shark took a huge bite of her left side. Her left leg had almost completely been severed, and her torso was severely damaged. From the descriptions people gave, it was suspected that the shark was a very young great white. Authorities hunted for the shark afterwards. They let out baited drum lines, but they were unsuccessful. The first shark nets deployed at Durban's beaches were in 1943. These had the desired effect of catching sharks and reducing attacks in the area. But the nets didn't extend to all swimming beaches. Almost 10 years later, in 1952, 7 gill nets, each 130 meters long, were laid along the Durban beachfront. In the first year of operation, 552 sharks were caught in these nets. The shark attacks that took place in Black December, which actually ran through to the following April, had a devastating impact on Durban's tourism industry. There are theories as to why Black December had such a high number of shark attacks. Apparently, whaling boats had been operating nearby, filling the seas with blood, which attracted the sharks to the area. Furthermore, there had been a series of storms that had flooded the land. Some livestock had been washed into the sea, enticing sharks to the coasts to feed on their carcasses. The stormy conditions had also churned up the sea, so visibility was poor. This is often given as a reason for shark attacks. If the water is not clear, then sharks can mistake people for their usual prey. Lastly, the tourism industry was thriving prior to Black December. Visitors splashed in the seas in their masses. The commotion and noise might have attracted sharks to the area, more so than usual. But following the string of shark attacks, tourists left the beaches in droves. The authorities needed to keep people safe. They needed to keep the tourism industry going. With more nets in place, gradually people returned to the beaches. They returned to the sea. Whilst the risks were still there, people felt better knowing that the beaches were surrounded in a safety barrier. The terrible shark attack on Faye was one of the most terrifying attacks during Black December. For beachgoers, the thought of a shark torpedoing itself feet away from the beach in knee-deep water is terrifying. They realized they could no longer even dip their feet in the water without the danger of meeting their untimely, final affliction. Sailing the oceans on a luxury yacht sounds like the perfect way to spend a day or two. But what do you do when the yacht gets caught in a severe storm miles from the nearest land? Hopefully, the situation doesn't turn out like it did for Captain John Lippoff and his crewmates. It was a clear, sunny day in October 1982, and Deborah Kiley was excited to complete a job that she had been given. She had been tasked with transporting a luxury 18-meter yacht from Maine to its new billionaire owner in Florida. Deborah was a confident sailor and had even competed in the 70,000-kilometer Whitbread round-the-world race, now called the Ocean Race. She even became the first American woman to complete the event in 1981. The 24-year-old woman was joined on her journey aboard the yacht by a group of her friends. There was the captain of the ship, John Lippoff, his girlfriend, Meg Mooney, and friends Brad Kavanaugh and Mark Adams. The day was perfect for sailing, with clear, bright blue skies. Deborah couldn't have asked for better conditions to set out on the luxury ship. The journey was to take 6 days long and be over 2,000 kilometers, so the group of friends would have plenty of time to enjoy the yacht and simply relax as they sailed to their destination. But things didn't exactly go to plan. 2 days into the journey, the skies above the group of 5 began to darken, and, in the distance, a brewing storm crept ever closer. By nightfall on the second day, the yacht was caught in the middle of a severe and violent tropical storm. The storm was so bad that winds up to 110 kilometers per hour and waves 10 meters high battered the yacht. Deborah had been sleeping in the cabin when the panicked voices of her friends awoke her. Rushing to the deck, the young woman was horrified to see that their captain, John Lippoff, was lying drunk at the wheel of the ship. Immediately, all 5 of the friends began screaming in fear. With the amount of water that was rushing over the yacht, the group knew that the worst possible thing was happening. They were sinking. With no other option, the group of 5 jumped off of the sinking yacht and into the rolling waves below. However, just before Meg was able to escape, she lost her footing and fell into a sharp part of the ship, cutting her legs severely. But with no time to do anything about it, the woman jumped into the water with her friends. Thankfully, Mark had been able to grab an inflatable dinghy, which the terrified group of young men and women clung to as they watched the 18-foot yacht sink beneath the ocean, never to be seen again. Acting quickly, all 5 crew members clambered onto the dinghy, but as Mark pulled himself into the boat, he felt something hard nudge his leg. Once in the safety of the dinghy, the group peered into the dark water below them, where Deborah was just about able to make out the shape of something that looked like a torpedo. Thinking that it was a fish at first, the young woman was horrified to realize what the creature actually was as it swam closer. Swimming just below the surface of the waves were hundreds of sharks. The animals had been drawn to the group as they had smelt the blood seeping from Meg's wound. Hungry and ready for a hunt, the sharks rammed against the dinghy from all directions. All Deborah and her friends could do was hold on to the small life raft and pray that they would make it through the night. As the hours waned on, the storm gradually faded and daylight broke through the darkness of the night. At first, the group of 5 friends were relieved. They believed that they would be able to get to safety in the daylight, as surely someone would be able to spot them in the dinghy. But as the hours passed by and all that Deborah and her friends could see was the never-ending expanse of blue sky and ocean, their hope quickly began to disappear. By the 3rd day of drifting aimlessly in the ocean, the group of 5 friends had no hope at all. Meg's wound had become seriously infected, leaving the young woman dealing with a severe case of blood poisoning. If she wasn't able to get help, and quickly, it was likely that she wouldn't last much longer. As well as that, everyone on the dinghy was starving and unbearably thirsty. And with so much water all around them, it wasn't long before John and Mark decided to brave the salty taste of the ocean and to gulp down as much as they could. The problem with this, though, is that the salt content in seawater is much higher than what can be processed by a human body. And because water is needed to process the salt in the body, it actually leaves the person more dehydrated than before they had a drink. After a few hours, both Mark and John had begun suffering from the side effects of the salt water. The severe dehydration that they were enduring led them to begin to hallucinate. John Lipoth was the first to succumb to his hallucinations. He claimed that he could see land far off in the distance. Unable to persuade him otherwise, the rest of the crew could only watch as their captain dove into the water and began swimming towards the land that only he could see. As the group of 4 watched John swim away, they all jumped as a scream tore through the air. The blood-curdling scream only lasted for 1 moment before silence descended once again. Deborah and the rest of the crew knew what had happened. The sharks, which had been lurking underneath them for days on end, had finally gotten their first meal. Horrified, Deborah, Meg, and Brad sat frozen in the dinghy, unsure of what to do next. But Mark was none the wiser. Lost in his own hallucinations, Mark stood up and told the rest of his friends that he needed to run to the store to buy some beer and cigarettes. Then, ignoring the panicked pleading of his friends, he stepped off of the dinghy and into the water. However, this time when the sharks attacked, Deborah and the other 2 crewmates were able to see a lot more. Because of how close Mark was to the life raft, the rest of the crew were able to feel as the great whites rammed into the boat underneath as they tore apart and bit into Mark. Every bump and rock of the little dinghy had Deborah crying. She could only imagine what was happening beneath her, how the sharks were sinking their 2.5-inch razor-sharp teeth into Mark's body and ripping him apart. The young woman never imagined that something so horrific would happen to her, and she was terrified that she would end up in the same situation as Mark and John. The hours passed by with Deborah, Brad and Meg lying in the dinghy, full of a faded mixture of urine, pus, and blood from Meg's wound. It was clear that things weren't looking good for the young woman. Her wound had become so infected that her leg had actually started to turn black. Eventually, as the fourth day rolled around, Deborah Kiley and Brad Kavanaugh awoke to find that Meg had passed away from her injury sometime during the night. Now, when people are stuck in extremely difficult situations, it can lead them to think about doing things that would never usually cross their minds. And with how hungry and thirsty he was, Brad couldn't help but contemplate eating Meg's body. It had been 4 days since he had had anything to eat and drink, and the young man knew that he couldn't continue to go on without eating her, or he would surely die too. However, Deborah was able to get him to come to his senses. She told Brad that eating Meg was out of the question. Not only was she their friend, but her infection was so bad that it was likely that it would do more harm than good to cannibalize her. But the two remaining friends also knew that Meg's body couldn't remain in the dinghy with them. Her wound was oozing pus from the infection, and if even a small amount of it got into Brad or Deborah's blood, then they would also become severely ill. With no other option, the two remaining survivors stripped Meg's body of her clothes and jewelry. They wanted to give the young woman's family something to remember her by. Then, after reciting the Lord's Prayer, Deborah and Brad gently pushed the body of their friend overboard. Not wanting to listen to the sharks devouring another one of their friends, Deborah and Brad went straight to sleep. By the 5th day at sea, Deborah and Brad had given up all hope of being rescued. Seeing all of the blood and other bodily fluids in the boat, the pair of survivors decided to try and clean up the dinghy. As Brad was trying to empty the raft, though, a rogue wave suddenly had him tumbling over the side of the boat and into the shark-infested waters below. Panicking, as neither he nor Deborah wanted the sharks to attack again, Brad tried his hardest to clamber back into the dinghy. But with how exhausted and weak he was, Brad was unable to lift himself up. Resigned to his fate, the young man clung onto the side of the raft, waiting for the moment when he would feel the painful bite of one of the sharks. Right at that moment, though, off in the distance, both Deborah and Brad spotted what looked to be a cargo ship. After confirming with each other that it was real and not a hallucination, Brad became reinvigorated. Seeing how close he was to being rescued, the young man managed to haul himself back onto the life raft. Once safely back in the dinghy, Deborah and Brad began yelling as loud as they could for help. After the cargo ship was close enough and had spotted the pair of survivors, they lifted both Deborah and Brad out of the water and onto the safety of the ship. Safely on board, the two survivors learned that they were 140 kilometers south of Cape Lookout. This meant that they drifted almost 150 kilometers off of their original course. But the ordeal wasn't over for the two of them. Those fateful 5 days at sea changed Deborah and Brad's life forever. For years after the incident, Deborah couldn't close her eyes without hearing the screams of her friends as they were eaten by sharks. She went on to write about her ordeal in 2 separate books, whilst also becoming a motivational speaker about surviving against all odds. Sadly, in 2012, at the age of 54, by causes unknown to the public, Deborah also met her final affliction.